Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Close Reading with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be examining Austen's defence of the novel, rant, as it's sometimes called. Argument, I think, is more apt. Remember, do please subscribe and hit the thumbs up. In another video, I asked whether we really think that Austen would write a novel that straightforwardly condemned novel reading, that straightforwardly suggested that silly young girls should not read silly novels because it would only corrupt them and foment their overactive imaginations. And as an aside, I really do like the bats on the side of the illustration here. It may seem rather odd to us now, but in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, when Austen published her novels, novels were considered by many to be dangerous and debilitating for young female readers. This is a fairly typical and by no means singular or unique example from Samuel Richardson's novel Clarissa, which was published in 1748-9 and was an absolute stonking bestseller. So one of the male characters in the novel, and by the way, Richardson was an absolute favourite of Austen's. So Colonel Morland says, of the weakness, credulity and inexperience of the fair sex is always women, that their learning, which chiefly consisted in inflaming novels and idle and improbable romances, contributed to enervate, that means to drain of energy, contributed to enervate and weaken their minds. Here, as in many other places, novels were seen as having a corrupting influence on the minds of those who read them. And this, remember, is within a novel. So it's a novel that condemns other novels. And Austen was fed up with such hypocrisy. So she has her heroine, Catherine Morland, in a novel sit down and read other novels. And then the narrative voice interjects into the narrative and speaks in the first person. That is, the narrative voice enters into the text to give her, or indeed his, own opinion. And this is the defence of the novel speech. Yes, novels, for I will not adopt that ungenerous and impolitic custom so common with novel writers of degrading by their contemptuous censure the very performances to the number of which they are themselves adding. The narrative voice calls out the hypocrisy of such novel writers as Richardson in Clarissa, that they censure other novels whilst adding to the general stock of novels. And there are two other examples that I want to draw your attention to, Fanny Burney in Evelina and Mariah Edgeworth in Belinda, whose relevance will become even clearer later. Fanny Burney in the preface to Evelina from 1778, and again this was a very popular 18th century novel. She writes, perhaps were it possible to effect the total extirpation. So extirpation means the destroying, the extermination, the removal. So were it possible to effect the total extirpation of novels, our young ladies in general and boarding school damsels in particular might profit from their annihilation. Burney is essentially saying young girls would benefit if novels had not been invented in the first place, or if they could now be eradicated. But they have been invented, and they're not going anywhere, so since the distemper they have spread seems incurable, since their contagion bids defiance to the medicine of advice or reprehension, and since they are found to baffle all the mental art of physic, save what is prescribed by the slow regimen of time and bitter diet of experience. And Burney's tone, in its over-the-top effusiveness, might suggest playfulness, but the ultimate point is serious. Surely all attempts to contribute to the number of those which may be read, if not with advantage, at least without injury, ought rather to be encouraged than condemned. Contemned means treated with contempt. Burney's argument is that novels can't be read with advantage, but they can at least be read without injuring the novel reader. And she casts this particularly as young ladies and damsels. There's a very sort of gendered portrayal of the novel reader. This kind of justification that Burney goes in for allows the author to have it both ways. Other unnamed novels, or the genre of novel more generally, remains condemned. It should still be treated with contempt. But this special novel, and indeed this special novelist, ought to be encouraged. It makes this novel exceptional from the general herd. So it promotes the individual at the expense of the general, and novels remain, generally speaking, injurious. Now, Burney's is one kind of self-excusing justification for writing a novel. An alternative defence was simply to deny that the text that you'd written was actually a novel, even when it was very clearly, demonstrably, palpably a novel. And that's the route that Mariah Edgeworth takes in Belinda from 1801. So this is the preface. Every author has a right to give what appellation he, or she obviously, may think proper to his works. The public have also a right to accept or refuse the classification that is presented. The following work is offered to the public as a moral tale, the author not wishing to acknowledge a novel. So the author of a novel does not want to acknowledge that what they've written is a novel. And within the novel, within Belinda itself, novel reading for young girls is presented as being corrupting. And this is chapter 27, so this is quite late on in the novel, and this is about Virginia's father and mother. She was scarcely 16 when he ran away with her from a boarding school, and we'll remember that Burney also talked about boarding school damsels. She was scarcely 16 when he ran away with her from a boarding school. He was at that time a gay officer, she a sentimental girl who had been spoiled by early novel reading. The message is clear. Novel reading spoils young girls, and moreover, novels prime them for being seduced. Austen's narrative voice continues that novelists such as Burney and Edgeworth are joining with their greatest enemies in bestowing the harshest epithets on such works, and scarcely ever permitting them to be read by their own heroine, who, if she accidentally take up a novel, is sure to turn over its insipid pages with disgust. Austen ironically inverts this image in Pride and Prejudice, where it is not the heroine who turns away from novels in disgust, but the unheroic Mr. Collins, whose taste is throughout the novel shown to be misguided. Mr. Collins readily assented, so Mr. Bennet has asked Mr. Collins if he will read something to the Bennet sisters. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back, and begging pardon protested that he never read novels. Now, a circulating library, that was another worry about the democratization of reading. So obviously in a library, poorer people could borrow books rather than having to buy them. And circulating libraries were business enterprises, and they chose what was popular, and novels were popular. For those worried about policing reading, this was a double whammy. Not only were poorer people reading, but poorer people were reading novels. Now, back to Northanger Abbey. The narrative voice continues, "Alas, if the heroine of one novel be not patronised, that means supported, by the heroine of another, from whom can she expect protection and regard? I cannot approve of it." Essentially, the point here is that heroines of novels ought to stick together, that one heroine should be seen reading another heroine, that heroines should enjoy reading novels, and by extension, of course, the idea that one novelist approves of other novelists. And this is clearly a gendered issue. In a patriarchal society, a young woman might expect protection and regard from men. In this case, reviewers. Generally speaking, reviewers in the period were men. But here, the narrative voice argues that heroines should look out for other heroines, that young women should look out for other young women, and essentially ignore reviewers, ignore men. As I've said, generally speaking, reviewers were men. Let us leave it to the reviewers to abuse such effusions of fancy at their leisure, and over every new novel talk in threadbare strains of the trash with which the press now groans. An example, this is an example from about a decade later, so in 1829. So even in Austen's time, it was a hackneyed image. The narrative voice talks of the threadbare strains of such observations. But it continued to be used in reviews for decades afterwards, and this is a review from The Critic, a weekly review of literature, fine arts and the drama, reviewing the admittedly not terribly great sounding novel Tales of Passion. And the review opens, "Novels, novels, novels. The press groans with them." And if there were fewer novels, the reviewer continues, there would be a much smaller accumulation of trash on the shelves of the bookseller. In Northanger Abbey, the narrative voice then moves on from noting the criticisms to considering the benefits of novels. "Let us not desert one another. We are an injured body." Earlier I spoke about Burney and Edgeworth promoting their individual novel at the expense of the collective. But here the narrative voice phrases her, or his, arguments in the collective. Let us not desert one another. We are an injured body. Us, we, our. Although our productions have afforded more extensive and unaffected pleasure than those of any other literary corporation in the world, no species of composition has been so much decried, decried meaning publicly denounced. From pride, ignorance or fashion, our foes are almost as many as our readers. Pride, ignorance and or fashion, of course, are terrible reasons for arguing for something. According to the narrative voice, the number one benefit of novel reading, the first benefit that's mentioned, is pleasure. Novels afford more extensive and unaffected pleasure than any other kinds of writing or kinds of reading. Again, the narrative voice goes against the general grain here. Generally, reading, especially for young women, was supposed to be for education and instruction. To say that reading could be a great pleasure was a real departure. And, of course, a great worry for those who don't think that pleasure is valuable, especially in young women. The narrative voice continues, "And while the abilities of the 900th abridger of the history of England, or of the man who collects and publishes in a volume," here again we have issues of gender coming into play. So generally speaking, those who published histories of England were men, although Austen did write her own playful history of England in her youth. And this here is the manuscript, which is still, you can still see in the British Library. And she says there, sort of halfway down, this is in Austen's handwriting, by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. So she's playing on the tone of pomposity and assumed authority that historians of England have frequently adopted. And Austen makes another joke about history books later in the novel when Catherine is talking to Henry. So Henry says, "I am fond of history." And Catherine says, "I wish I were too. I read it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars or pestilences on every page, the men also good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome, and yet I often think it odd that it should be so dull, for a great deal of it must be invention. The speeches that are put into the heroes' mouths, their thoughts and designs, the chief of all this must be invention. And invention is what delights me in other books." The narrative voice uses the naivety of Catherine to voice a serious concern. So Catherine might look as if she's saying something childish and silly, and yet she's actually articulating a serious, important point, which is that histories claim to portray important truths. They claim to be proper books which ought to be taken seriously, and yet they must be just as full of invention as novels. Catherine's words also highlight the gender disparity. Histories concern men doing the doings and quarrels of popes and kings, and hardly any women at all. And here the novel Northanger Abbey gets away with something really quite radical. That history is not objective fact, that it's subjective reporting determined by the interests of the historian. It gets away with it because this assertion is put into the mouth of naive, silly, childish Catherine. It's therefore easy to dismiss for those keen to dismiss such an observation. And this is a technique that Austen uses repeatedly, which is to put a serious point in the mouth of an apparently silly character, so that the view put forward is easy to overlook or to discount. But not so, of course, for the thinking reader. Really, this is an example of Austen having her cake and eating it too, of saying something radical, but not wanting to appear to be saying something radical. She's covering her back, effectively. The reason it's radical is because it's challenging the accepted gender hierarchy, which is that histories talk about men and they talk about what's important, whereas novels don't. So, while the abilities of the 900th abridger of the history of England, implying, of course, that the press groans with histories just as much as it does with novels, or the man, note it's gendered again, the man who collects and publishes in a volume, so there's no new invention here, just recycling old pieces of writing. So the man who collects and publishes in a volume some dozen lines of Milton, Pope and Prior, these are all male poets who are long dead. So John Milton, writer of Paradise Lost, is a 17th century poet who died in 1674. Alexander Pope, neoclassical poet who died in 1744, and Matthew Prior, who died in 1721. So publishes those poets with a paper from The Spectator. The Spectator was a magazine that operated from 1711 to 12, and surprise, surprise, it did not encourage novel reading in young women. So this is what it said in April 1712. Under this head of abstinence, I shall also advise my fair readers, and again that means women, to be in a particular manner careful how they meddle with romances, chocolate, novels. I like that romances, chocolate, and novels are all kind of associated with each other, then perhaps even as now. That women should not meddle with romances, chocolates, and novels and the like inflamers, which I look upon as very dangerous. And we'll remember that Richardson had, who I mentioned earlier, also referred to inflaming novels. So we've got these male poets, this chapter from The Spectator, and a chapter from Sterne. And Lawrence Sterne was a sentimental writer who had died in 1768. So all these old men who were long dead are eulogized by 1,000 pens. There seems almost a general wish of decrying the capacity and undervaluing the labour of the novelist. And I think it's a really interesting choice of diction that Austen has made here. And there's a subtle sort of distinction from what you might think this originally says to what it does actually say. So you might initially expect it to say that these male long dead writers are eulogized by 1,000 pens, and there seems almost a general wish of decrying the capacity and undervaluing the novelist. But she explicitly draws attention to the labour of the novelist. So she's expressly valuing work, expressly valuing the labour. So recycling what's already been highly valued, the man who collects and publishes in a volume the high status works of other men, is eulogized by 1,000 pens, the reviewers, the other men, but the labour, the hard work of the writer of lower status kinds of writing, in this case novels, is decried and undervalued. And the narrative voice now really gets to the heart of the matter. So earlier, the pleasure that novels afford was praised. And now, so there seems almost a general wish of decrying the capacity and undervaluing the labour of the novelist, and of slighting the performances which have only genius, wit, and taste to recommend them. Only genius, wit, and taste. You know, what more do you want from a text? I mentioned earlier Burney and Edgeworth, who were ironically both very popular novelists, who were also the kinds of sometime novel bashing novel writers that Austen was alluding to. I also mentioned earlier that Austen thought this novel bashing tactic was ungenerous and impolitic. I particularly want to draw your attention to the word impolitic. So the narrative voice argues that it isn't sensible politics, that this isn't a sensible strategy for novel writers. And I've drawn on some of the gender politics at play here, that it is impolitic for young women, heroines of course, but also young women novel writers and novel readers, not to patronise, not to support each other. That it would be much better politics in terms of promoting novels for novel writers to support one another. Austen had also said that the strategy of novelists such as Burney and Edgeworth was ungenerous. Not so with Northanger Abbey's narrative voice. I am no novel reader. I seldom look into novels. Do not imagine that I often read novels. Oh, it is all very well for a novel. Such is the common cant. So here the narrative voice repeats and quotes what's often said. Cant means sort of often repeated, conventional or trite opinions. And what are you reading, miss? Oh, it is only a novel, replies the young lady. And throughout this passage, as I've been drawing attention to, the discussion of novel readers is terribly gendered. Oh, it is only a novel, replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. It is only Cecilia or Camilla or Belinda. Cecilia, published in 1782, Camilla, published in 1796, are both novels by Fanny Burney, and Belinda, from 1801, is the novel I quoted earlier by Mariah Edgeworth. So Northanger Abbey's narrative voice will not condemn these novel writers as they had condemned others. Instead, this novelist holds them up, will patronise them and support them. And now we get to the fundamental point, the great value of novels. It is only Cecilia or Camilla or Belinda, or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humour are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. What more could one want from art? Novels display the greatest powers of the mind, the most thorough knowledge of human nature in the best chosen language. These are beneficial for young women readers, arguably far more useful for coping with life than a history of England that deals in wars and pestilences and popes and kings. Novels might actually equip young women to deal with life far better. They might actually provide a more useful education. And what's more, rather than being dull histories, in Catherine's words, novels embody the liveliest effusions of wit and humour. So this novel writer comes out fighting for the performances to which she is herself adding. And I leave you with the inarguable, indisputable words of Henry Tilney. The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. I do hope you've enjoyed going through Austen's defence of the novel in Northanger Abbey. If you have, please subscribe, hit the thumbs up, and do check out my other videos and comment down below.